Tommy Wescott lost his left leg at 25. What he didn't lose was his ear. For 18 years he showed up at auction barns before dawn with a stethoscope, not a degree, not a certification, not the credentials that the industry said you needed, and he heard things inside running engines that no visual inspection could find. His competitors spent 2 years publicly calling his method unvalidated. Then his competitor's most important client called Tommy instead. Then the competitor stood in a parking lot in front of a group of dealers and learned, in public, what it costs to have an opinion before you have the evidence. Every machine tells you what it is, if you know how to listen. The question is, how long does it take to learn that skill, and what does it cost you if you stop? The auction barn in Boone County, Indiana smells the same in every season: diesel and straw and the dry sweet odor of machinery that has been worked hard and stored cold, the smell of iron that has earned its rest. Tommy Wescott had been breathing this air since he was 6 years old, when his father first brought him to the Saturday machinery auctions in Lebanon and set him on the hood of a tractor and said, "Listen. Not watch. Listen. Every machine tells you what it is," his father said, "if you know how to hear it." Tommy was 6 years old and he did not know what his father meant. He would not know, fully, for another 30 years. But he began to listen, and listening became habit, and habit became skill, and skill became the thing that people who did not understand it called a gift. Tommy Wescott was 44 years old in the spring of 1993, and he was missing his left leg from the knee down, and he was the best machinery evaluator in 3 counties, and he had built a small auction appraisal business from the 3 things the accident had left him with: his right leg, his 2 hands, and 38 years of listening. The man who was about to make his life more difficult was named Richard Bauer, and he was standing at the back of the auction barn in a pressed shirt and a leather portfolio, and he had just lost his most important client to Tommy Wescott, and he had decided to do something about it. This is the story of what Tommy Wescott proved. The auction started at 8 in the morning, which meant Tommy Wescott arrived at 6. He drove the modified F-150, hand controls installed by his brother-in-law Dale in 1985, 180,000 miles on the odometer, maintained with the same systematic attention he gave to every machine he worked with, down the county road from his house in Thorntown and turned into the auction yard as the sky was going from black to dark gray to the pale silver of a March morning that has not yet decided what it wants to be. He had 2 hours before the crowd arrived. He needed 2 hours. He got out of the truck with the economy of motion he had developed over 18 years of working with a prosthetic leg, not the dramatic, labored movement that people who didn't know him expected, but the efficient adaptation of a man who has solved an engineering problem and no longer thinks about the solution. He took his clipboard, his flashlight, and his stethoscope and walked to the first piece of equipment. There were 47 items in today's auction. Tommy had the lot list in his clipboard, organized by his own cross-reference of manufacturer, approximate vintage, and what he expected to find when he got close. He called this pre-dawn work a scan, a first-pass assessment moving at roughly 3 minutes per piece, covering the primary acoustic indicators and flagging anything that needed longer attention. A scan was not the same as a full documentation assessment. A full assessment, the kind required when the stakes were high enough to justify legal documentation, ran at 10 minutes per piece and required formal notation. The scan told him what to look for. The full assessment told him what was there. He had learned early that confusing the two cost clients money. He started with the tractors. The evaluation of a used tractor is not primarily a visual exercise. This is what most people, including a significant number of people who thought they knew machinery, did not understand. The visual tells you the obvious things: condition of the sheet metal, evidence of previous repairs, quality of the rubber. These things matter. But they are not the primary information. The primary information lives in the sounds and the vibrations and the temperatures that a machine produces when you interact with it, when you start the engine and let it warm up and listen to what the warm-up sounds like, when you put the transmission through its range and feel for the hesitations and catches that indicate wear in specific gears, when you press the stethoscope probe to the engine block at different points and hear whether the bearing noise is the normal low-frequency conversation of metal doing its designed work or the higher, harsher quality of metal failing. Tommy moved through the equipment lineup in the gray March morning with the focused efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. He started each tractor, listened to the cold start, listened to the warm-up, put it through the range, shut it down and applied the stethoscope. By 8 o'clock he had completed the scan of all 47 items. He had personal notes on 3 items he thought were significantly mispriced, 2 overvalued, 1 undervalued. The undervalued item was a 1967 Oliver 1650 that the lot description characterized as running, needs work. Tommy had started it, listened for 4 minutes, and concluded that what it needed was a carburetor rebuild and new points, a half day's work, maybe $80 in parts, and that the engine itself was in remarkable condition for a 26-year-old machine. He expected it to sell for between $1, $200 and $1, $800. He thought it was worth $3, $500. His client that morning was Warren Calloway, a man who arrived at 8:15 in a late model Cadillac and was looking to acquire 12 pieces of equipment for a leasing portfolio. Calloway had come with a reference from a dealer in Noblesville, who had described Tommy Wescott as the best equipment evaluator in the region. The reference had not mentioned the prosthetic leg. Calloway found Tommy between two lines of equipment, crouching beside the front axle of a 1977 John Deere 4430 with a stethoscope pressed to the differential housing. He looked at this for a moment, not at the stethoscope, which he had not expected, but at the crouching, which was not what he had expected either. He had expected limitations in mobility, awkwardness, something that signaled the difficulty of the work. What he saw was the opposite, a man who had gotten to the ground with the efficient movement of someone for whom this was unremarkable, who was holding the stethoscope with the precise application of someone who knew exactly what information he was extracting. He waited until Tommy stood and introduced himself. "I hear good things about your work," Calloway said. "I'd like to talk about an ongoing arrangement." "Tell me what you need," Tommy said. 12 pieces today. I need to know what the lot descriptions are hiding." "The lot descriptions are optimistic," Tommy said. "In the usual ways." He walked Calloway through his findings on the 12 pieces, including the Oliver 1650. "Carburetor and points," he said. "Half a day's work. The engine is sound. It'll sell for $12 to $1800. It's worth $3500. Calloway bought the Oliver at $1, $350. He had it running perfectly within a week at a total cost of $1, $430. He sold it 3 months later for $3, $800. The 3 pieces Tommy had flagged as worse than described, Calloway passed on. By the end of the year, 2 had experienced major failures in the hands of other buyers. In each case, the repair costs exceeded the purchase price. Calloway called Tommy the following week and offered a retainer. What he did not say, because he was not entirely sure how to say it, was that the parking lot conversation had revised something in his understanding that had been incorrect when he arrived. He had come with the unconscious assumption that physical limitation produced professional limitation. The assumption was wrong. He understood this clearly by the end of the conversation, and he had the Oliver's numbers to confirm it. He did not mention this to Tommy. He did not need to. The Oliver's numbers were the argument. Paul Wescott had taught his son to listen to machinery the way some fathers teach their sons to play an instrument, not by explaining the theory first but by playing alongside and letting the ear develop its own understanding. The first question Paul asked, when Tommy was about 8 years old, was, "That case 930 over there. Tell me what you hear." Tommy walked to the running tractor and stood beside it and listened. "Sounds good," he said. "Sounds strong." "Listen longer," Paul said. Tommy listened for 3 full minutes, a long time for an 8-year-old to stand still, and at the 2-minute mark he heard it, a faint, periodic unevenness in the engine note. Not a miss, exactly. More like a hesitation. "There's something," he said. "Like a hiccup." "Number 4 cylinder," Paul said. "Rings are worn. Won't pass a compression test." He looked at his son with the expression he reserved for moments he considered important. "The machine is trying to tell you what it is. Most people aren't listening. You were listening. That's the beginning." Tommy had expanded this lesson for 35 years, had read everything written about machinery acoustics and vibration analysis, had corresponded with engineers at 3 universities. He had at one point been invited to consult for a manufacturer developing acoustic diagnostic systems for their service network. He had declined. Not because the work wasn't interesting but because it would have taken him away from the auctions, and the auctions were where the work was, not in a laboratory but in actual conditions, with actual machines, with noise and weather and time pressure and the 100 variables that laboratory conditions could not replicate. The accident had happened in April 1975, 6 weeks before Tommy's 26th birthday, on a farm west of Lebanon where he had gone to evaluate a combine. The header had a hydraulic failure while Tommy was standing in front of it. He had moved, but not fast enough. The surgeons had saved what they could. What they could save was not the leg. He spent 3 months in the hospital and 2 years in the active despair that involves constant motion, the attempt to outrun a fact that cannot be outrun. He worked through the adaptation to the prosthetic with the systematic determination of a man who treats every problem as an engineering problem. He rebuilt his evaluation methods from the ground up, figuring out which movements needed to be approached differently and what he had always been doing wrong anyway and could now correct. His wife Ruth had said, in the 3rd year after the accident, When it was clear he was not going to stop, you adapted to the leg like it was a carburetor problem. It was an engineering problem, Tommy said. Not to me it wasn't, Ruth said. She was right, and he knew it. The engineering frame had been necessary, had been survival, but it was his frame, not hers. She had watched the man she married be remade into something that moved differently and thought about himself differently, and that experience had been hers to navigate on different terms. They had worked it out. 31 years of marriage had given them enough time to work out most things. What the accident had clarified, in the years of reconstruction, was the nature of the work itself. Before, he had thought the work was the whole process, the walking and the physical inspection and the listening together. After, when the physical parts needed redesigning, he understood that the core was the listening. Everything else was supporting infrastructure. Knowing this had made him better, more precise, more systematic, more conscious of his own logic. Ruth had pointed this out a few years after the accident. The work got better, she said. Yes, Tommy said. I wish there had been another way to get there, Ruth said. He had no answer to this. There wasn't one. Richard Bauer had been evaluating agricultural equipment in Boone County since 1985, and the arrival of Warren Calloway's business in Tommy Wescott's client list had displaced what had been Richard's most substantial account. Richard was 41 years old, held a degree in agricultural engineering from Purdue, and ran an equipment appraisal business that was larger and more formally structured than Tommy's: 2 assistants, printed report formats, a comprehensive insurance policy. He was a competent assessor, thorough and methodical, accurate within the normal range of what an equipment assessment could tell you from visual inspection, our counts, and maintenance records review. What he could not do was hear the condition. This was the differentiating capability, and Richard Bauer knew it, and this knowledge produced in him a specific frustration, the frustration of a man who understands the gap between his own capability and someone else's but cannot determine whether the gap is real or whether it is being claimed to be larger than it actually is. He had a specific argument he had been developing since he lost the Callaway account, that acoustic assessment was impressive to observe and easy to believe in, but that the track record was not adequately established, that the financial decisions being made on the basis of Tommy's assessments were ahead of the evidence, and that the appropriate professional response was to question the methodology publicly before it caused harm. He made this argument at the County Agricultural Equipment Dealers Association meeting in May 1993. What's Wescott's error rate? Someone asked. That's exactly the point, Richard said. Nobody knows. He works from a notebook and his own system. There's no external validation. He made the argument again at the Fall Equipment Appraisal Conference in Indianapolis. More specifically, we have a methodology that is standardized, documented, legally defensible, and externally validated. When an assessor working from a non-standard, non-documented, non-peer-reviewed methodology claims superior results, the burden of proof is on the claim, not on the standard. He did not name Tommy Wescott specifically. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. Word reached Tommy through a mutual contact. Ruth told him that evening. Richard Bauer's been saying things at the professional associations, she said. He's calling your methodology unvalidated. Saying the clients are taking on risk they don't understand. Tommy ate his dinner. Is he wrong? Ruth asked. He's right that my methodology isn't formally validated, Tommy said. He's wrong about the error rate. But he doesn't have access to my records, so he doesn't know the error rate. Are you going to respond? Not with words, Tommy said. Ruth had been married to him long enough to understand what this meant. The Hendricks County sale is in September, she said. Bauer attends all the major sales, Tommy said. And you'll be there. I'm always there, Tommy said. The Hendricks County machinery auction in September 1993 had, as its most prominent lot, a 1980 John Deere 4040 tractor that Richard Bauer had inspected the previous day and assessed as above average condition, approximately 200 hours on the engine, well maintained, worth a bid of $18,000 to $21,000. He had talked about the 4040 at the pre-auction gathering that assessors and dealers held in the parking lot before the public arrived. Not boastfully, Richard was not a boastful man, but with the professional confidence of someone sharing a reliable finding. Clean machine, he told the 3 dealers standing with him. Ours are consistent with the condition. Whoever maintained it knew what they were doing. Tommy Wescott had scanned the same tractor at 5:45 in the morning, before even the gathering. He had run his standard sequence, 8 stethoscope positions on the engine block, transmission range, rear differential, and noted his findings. When Richard Bauer arrived at the gathering and began talking about the 4040, Tommy was standing at the edge of the group with his own coffee, listening. He waited until Richard finished. "The hour meter's been reset," Tommy said. The group turned toward him. Richard Bauer looked at him with the expression of a man who has made a public statement and is now being publicly contradicted. "The meter reads 6,241, Richard said. "I checked it myself." "The meter reads 6,241, Tommy agreed. "The engine runs like a machine with 10 to 12,000 hours. The wear characteristics in the fuel system, the combustion quality, the bearing noise profile, none of it is consistent with 6,200 hours on a maintained machine. This engine has been worked hard for a long time." The group was quiet. 3 dealers and 2 other assessors were looking between Richard and Tommy with the careful attention of people watching something that has professional significance. "You can tell the engine's actual hours from the sound?" Richard asked. His voice was professionally controlled. "From the combination of factors," Tommy said. "The sound is the primary indicator. The bearing noise frequency and character specifically. This engine's bearings sound like a machine that's been through considerably more than the meter shows. I used the hour meter, the maintenance records, and a comprehensive visual inspection," Richard said. "Standard use PAPE compliant methodology." "The hour meter was reset," Tommy said. "The maintenance records are for the machine before the reset. The visual won't show you internal engine wear." The 4040 sold at $16,500, significantly below Richard's suggested range, because 2 of the dealers in that parking lot had heard the exchange and bid cautiously. The buyer, not one of Tommy's clients, discovered within 4 months that the engine was in significantly worse condition than the meter suggested. The repair estimate was $9,200. Richard Bauer called Tommy the following week. "I want to understand how you identified the reset meter," he said. His voice had the quality of a man who has been wrong in public and is deciding what to do with that fact. "Come to an auction with me," Tommy said. "I'll show you." They went to 3 auctions together in October and November 1993, and Richard Bauer arrived at the first one with his leather portfolio and the barely visible bearing of a man who has placed his ego somewhere else for the duration. Tommy noticed this and appreciated it. It was the right bearing for learning something. At the first auction, Tommy took Richard through his methodology on 6 tractors, explaining as he worked, pointing to the stethoscope positions, describing what he was hearing and why it mattered. Richard listened and took notes and asked technical questions that built toward a framework he could use. At the second auction, they evaluated independently and then compared. On 14 pieces, their major findings agreed. On 3, they differed. On 2 of the 3, the difference was in Tommy's favor, conditions Richard's visual inspection had missed. On 1, Richard's documentation of maintenance records had caught something Tommy's acoustic assessment had not flagged. "Your method is better at some things," Tommy said. "Mine is better at other things." "Your accuracy on internal engine condition is significantly better than mine," Richard said. "Your accuracy on documented history and formal compliance is significantly better than mine," Tommy said. "I don't use PAPE compliant reports." "You do." "You're suggesting a collaboration," Richard said. "I'm noting the facts," Tommy said. "What you do with them is your decision." At the third auction, Richard said nothing for 2 hours. He walked alongside Tommy, watched, listened. At the end he said, "You hear things I cannot hear. I don't think I can learn to hear them the way you do." "No," Tommy said. "Not in 3 months." "Can you learn it at all? Starting from scratch?" "The conceptual framework you can learn. The pattern library, 40 years of agricultural equipment failure modes, takes 40 years to build. You can learn to use mine without building your own. By bringing you in on the assessments where it matters." "If that's how you want to use it," Tommy said. Richard was quiet for a moment, doing the careful thing he did, revising a position he had held publicly. "I said things at the professional association meetings about your methodology," he said. "About the lack of formal validation. I said them before I had done what I should have done first, which was to sit down with you and understand the methodology on its own terms." He paused. "That was wrong." "You raised a legitimate concern," Tommy said. "The methodology isn't formally validated." "That's true. The question is whether the track record answers the concern, and you couldn't evaluate the track record without seeing it." "Will you show me the track record?" Tommy brought out 19 years of assessment reports and follow-up documentation. The accuracy rate on major condition findings was 94.3%. The accuracy rate for specific component level findings was 88.7%. Both figures exceeded the published accuracy rates for standard visual inspection methodology. Richard drove home and sat at his kitchen table for a long time. Then he called Tommy and proposed a formal collaboration on the larger estate sales and portfolio acquisitions, Tommy's acoustic assessment plus Richard's use PAPE compliant reports. They negotiated the structure for 20 minutes and arrived at something fair to both. "One more thing," Richard said before hanging up. "Go ahead. I'm going to correct the record at the next association meeting. What I said about unvalidated methodology, I was working from incomplete information. The membership deserves an accurate statement." He paused. "And I'd like to co-author a brief paper for the Indiana Equipment Appraisers newsletter, describing the acoustic methodology, describing my process of evaluating it. With your review of the technical descriptions." This was the harder thing, not just the private acknowledgement but the public correction. Richard had said it without being asked. "Write the draft," Tommy said. "Send it to me." He sent it to Ruth first. Ruth read it and said, "He's being more honest than he has to be." "I know," Tommy said. "That took something," Ruth said. "It did," Tommy said. He sent Richard his comments on the technical descriptions, minimal, and the paper was published in the spring of 1994. Ruth Wescott had a way of seeing the things that Tommy, who spent his attention on machines, sometimes missed about people. She had watched Warren Calloway at the March auction from across the lot, before he introduced himself to Tommy, and she had seen the assessment he was making, the slight pause, the recalibration, the revision of expectation. She had seen this expression on many faces over 18 years. She told Tommy about it that evening. "He revised his expectations when he saw you," she said. "Before you spoke. The stethoscope and the crouching changed something." "Most people do," Tommy said. "Does it bother you?" "Less than it used to," Tommy said. "In the beginning I took it as a statement about my ability. Now I understand it as a statement about their assumptions." "What changed?" "The results," Tommy said. "You can argue with assumptions. You can't argue with results." Ruth looked at him. "That's the clean version." "It's not the whole version," Tommy said. "The whole version was this, that the accident had forced him to understand, at a level that pure intellectual understanding cannot reach, the difference between what a person could do and what observers believed a person could do. He had lived this difference from both sides. Before the accident, he was a man who could do certain things and was believed to be able to do them. After the accident, he was a man who could do the same things and was not, initially, believed to be able to do them. The capability had not changed. The belief had. What this taught him was that the belief would follow the results, and that the results were the only argument worth making. Not the argument he could make in words before doing the work. The argument the work made for itself. Richard Bauer corrected the record, Ruth said, some weeks after the association meeting. "Someone told me." "I know," Tommy said. "Did you expect him to?" Tommy thought about it honestly. "I hoped he would," he said. "I didn't expect it." "Why not?" "Because correcting yourself publicly is harder than being wrong privately," Tommy said. "Most people manage the second without managing the first." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "He came around the right way," she said. "He looked at the evidence and revised his position and said so publicly." "That's the right way." "Yes," Tommy said. "It is." The Holbrook estate sale was the largest auction in Boone County in the summer of 1993, 140 items from a 400-acre operation worked for 60 years by one family. Warren Calloway was bringing 4 potential investors. Tommy arrived at 5:30 and worked 6 hours, completing a full scan before the auction began. 14 items worth paying attention to, he told Calloway at 8 o'clock, handing him a 5-page summary. 7 significantly better than described, 3 significantly worse, 4 with specific conditions the lot descriptions don't capture. One of the investors, Gerald Park, who ran an equipment rental operation in Anderson, interrupted the third walkthrough description. "You're telling me you got all this from listening?" "Listening, touch, temperature," Tommy said. "Vibration through the frame and through the stethoscope." "Without running them through their full range?" "This is a scan, 3 minutes per piece, primary acoustic indicators," Tommy said. "At full documentation level, I run them more thoroughly and take 10 minutes per piece minimum. The scan tells me where to focus. The documentation assessment tells me what's there." He paused. "Today is a scan. The findings are accordingly flagged." Gerald Park looked at the stethoscope. Then, Tommy saw it, he looked at the prosthetic leg. Then he looked at Calloway. "He's the real thing," Calloway said. The Holbrook sale produced, for Calloway's investors, a result that documented itself over the following 18 months. 14 of the 17 acquisitions made based on Tommy's assessment performed within the range of his prediction. 3 required unexpected maintenance, all pieces Tommy had flagged as borderline but that the investors had chosen to acquire anyway. Gerald Park called Tommy directly 3 months later and became his 4th regular client. By June of 1993, Warren Calloway had become Tommy's most demanding client and his most instructive one, the kind of man who asked genuine questions from genuine curiosity rather than performing skepticism. "Walk me through the diesel combustion knock," Calloway said one morning, standing beside a running 1975 Case 1070 tractor. "You said there was a combustion knock. I can't hear it." Tommy took the stethoscope off his neck and handed it to Calloway and indicated a point on the engine block. Calloway pressed the probe to the metal and listened. "I hear a tapping," Calloway said. "Normal. That's valve train noise. Now move the probe here," Tommy indicated a point lower on the block, "and listen. It's different. Heavier. That's the combustion knock. Heavier, less regular, slightly lower frequency. Fuel igniting before the piston is at the right position. Over time it damages the piston and the rod bearing. How do you tell if it's recent damage or years of it? You listen to the rod bearings specifically." Tommy took the stethoscope back and made a series of precise applications to the lower block, narrating as he moved the probe. "If they're damaged, the knock has a different character, more of a thud than a tap, and it changes with engine load. Let me show you." This was how it went through the spring and into summer, Calloway asking questions that pushed Tommy to articulate things he usually did intuitively, and the articulation occasionally producing refinements in Tommy's own understanding. It was the most professionally useful relationship he had had since his father's death. Warren Calloway arrived at Tommy's house on a Thursday evening in October 1994 with a proposal more complicated than the ones he usually brought. He sat at the kitchen table with Tommy and Ruth. Ruth was always present for the business conversations that mattered, because Tommy had learned 20 years ago that her judgment about people was more reliable than his. "I want to acquire a full operational fleet from the Meridian Farm Dispersal," Calloway said. 48 pieces, a 1,600-acre operation. If the equipment is what it appears to be, the portfolio is worth approximately $780. I'm planning to offer $580. Full documentation assessment? Tommy asked. Not a scan? Full documentation. The stakes require it. 48 pieces at full documentation level, 10 minutes each minimum, is approximately 8 hours. I can do that if I have documentation support. I've arranged 2 graduate students from the Purdue Agricultural Engineering program, Calloway said. They manage the paperwork. You do the assessment. What's the complicating factor? Ruth asked. James Meridian's son is contesting the estate, Calloway said. He's claiming the equipment was undervalued in the estate inventory. His attorney has hired a competing assessor from Indianapolis, a man named Hollings, certified appraiser, certified agricultural equipment assessor, engineering background. Hollings's report will be used to challenge my purchase price if I bid below the estate inventory value. So my assessment will be in direct competition with a credentialed appraiser's report, Tommy said. In a probate court proceeding. Yes. Tommy looked at Ruth. Richard Bauer, Ruth said. Tommy nodded. Richard has the formal use PAPE credentials, he said to Calloway. He knows my methodology, we've been collaborating for a year. If his documentation format accompanies my acoustic findings, the court has a credentialed framework to evaluate the results. Will he agree? I'll ask him, Tommy said. After Calloway left, Ruth sat across from Tommy at the kitchen table. This is the one where the methodology gets evaluated in front of a judge, she said. The auction floor is a market, results are evaluated by whether buyers make money. A courtroom is an evidentiary context. The standard is different. Not whether the method works, Ruth said. Whether the method can be explained and documented well enough to be trusted by someone with no experience of it. Exactly, Tommy said. I need to prepare the explanation. I'll help, Ruth said. I'll ask the questions the attorney will ask. They spent 4 evenings on exactly this, and Ruth was, as she usually was when she focused on something, more useful than he had anticipated. Richard Bauer agreed to the arrangement on the first call. You did me the courtesy of showing me your records before I'd done more damage with my public statements, Richard said. The least I can do is provide the documentation format when it matters. A pause. Also, if your methodology holds up in court, it establishes a precedent that strengthens the field. That benefits everyone, including assessors using standard methodology. They spent 3 weeks on the documentation format, translating Tommy's acoustic findings into USPAPE-compliant language without losing precision. They tested the format on 6 assessments during this period, refining it where the translation broke down. The goal was not to make the acoustic findings look like visual inspection findings but to express them clearly enough that someone without acoustic diagnostic experience could evaluate them on their merits. Tommy spent the remaining weeks preparing the expert testimony explanation, clear, step by step, each stage of the acoustic assessment process expressible in terms a person without the skill could understand. He was not comfortable with this. He had always let the work make the argument. But the Meridian proceeding required the work and the explanation together. The day of the Meridian auction was cold and clear, the kind of early November morning in Indiana where the sky is deep blue and the air carries the smell of frozen ground. Tommy arrived at 5 o'clock. The 2 Purdue graduate students, Marcus Webb and Janet Ayers, both mid-20s, both serious, arrived at 5:30. Marcus handled the audio recording of Tommy's verbal assessments. Janet managed the documentation log in Richard's format. Full documentation level, Tommy had told them the previous week. Everything recorded. 10 minutes per piece minimum. If you miss something, say so immediately. He began at 5:15 with the most important piece, a 1988 Casey 2594 tractor, the highest value item in the dispersal and the one most likely to anchor Hollings's counter-assessment. He worked the 2594 for 20 minutes. He found what he had predicted from the lot list, well maintained through its first 4,000 hours, then subjected to extended use without adequate attention to the fuel system. The injectors were worn, not failing, but running outside their optimal specification. The engine bearings were sound. The transmission was sound. The hydraulics were sound. Overall condition, above average, with the injector wear as a specific, quantifiable condition constituting a disclosure issue. A condition invisible to visual inspection. He made his verbal assessment for the recording and moved to the next piece. For 8 hours and 22 minutes, Tommy Wescott moved through the Meridian dispersal at full documentation level, the methodical depth that distinguished this work from a scan, that turned acoustic impressions into a legal record. Marcus and Janet kept pace, maintaining records precise enough to be reproducible. He found 19 pieces in above average condition, 21 in average condition, and 8 in below average condition. He identified 5 pieces with specific conditions requiring disclosure. The most significant was the 2594's injector wear. Warren Calloway met him at the parking area as the auction began. Tommy gave him the summary in 4 minutes. "What will Hollings report?" Calloway asked. "What a standard visual inspection and our count methodology can find," Tommy said. "Which is accurate for what it can find. He won't find the injector wear on the 2594. He may not find 2 of the other specific conditions I identified. So his report will show higher average condition. Probably. By the amount that visual inspection tends to miss." Calloway looked at the auction barn. "Let's see what happens," he said. The estate dispute came before Indiana probate court judge Patricia Hollingsworth in February 1995. The Meridian Sons attorney argued the equipment had been sold below fair market value by approximately $180,000, based on Hollings's assessment, which had found the portfolio in above average overall condition and valued it at $728,000. Calloway's attorney argued that fair market value had been accurately established by Tommy's assessment, which had identified specific conditions affecting the portfolio's operational value that were not visible through visual inspection methodology. Tommy testified for 2 hours. The first challenge came from the Meridian attorney: no formal engineering degree, no certification from any recognized appraisal organization, methodology not peer-reviewed. On what basis should this court accept your assessment over that of a certified appraiser and certified agricultural equipment assessor? On the basis of the evidence the method produces, Tommy said. My method is not credentialed in the standard way. What it is accurate, and the accuracy is demonstrable from the record. What record? He had the records with him, 240 pages organized by assessment date, equipment type, specific findings, and follow-up condition. The accuracy rate on major condition findings was 94.3%. The accuracy rate for specific component level findings was 88.7%. Both figures exceeded the published accuracy rates for standard visual inspection methodology. Hollings was on the stand for 40 minutes after Tommy. He was a fair man. Under cross-examination, he acknowledged that visual inspection methodology did not include acoustic analysis and that acoustic analysis was a recognized diagnostic method in industrial equipment maintenance contexts. Is it possible, Callaway's attorney asked, that the conditions Mr. Wescott identified, the injector wear on the 2594, the hydraulic issues on lots 34 and 41, are conditions that your methodology could have missed? Hollings considered this carefully. Visual inspection methodology is designed to identify conditions that are visible or measurable through standard testing, he said. Conditions primarily detectable through acoustic analysis are outside the standard methodology. So yes, if those conditions exist, my methodology might not identify them. And do those conditions exist? I did not perform acoustic analysis, Hollings said. I cannot speak to what acoustic analysis would find. Judge Hollingsworth issued her ruling 3 weeks later. She found in favor of Callaway's purchase price, citing the documentation record establishing the accuracy of Tommy's acoustic assessment methodology and the specific conditions identified that were not visible through standard visual inspection. She noted that the methodology, while non-standard in form, was demonstrably accurate in its results, and that the combination of acoustic analysis and formal documentation met the evidentiary standard for reliable expert testimony. She also noted, in a passage that Tommy read several times, that the combination of a non-standard method with standard documentation was an approach with merit beyond the specific case. The Meridian ruling changed Tommy Wescott's professional situation in 3 specific ways. The first was his status in the legal context. The ruling established that his methodology, properly documented, with a demonstrable accuracy record, was admissible as expert testimony. This opened work he had not previously had access to: estate disputes, insurance claims, commercial equipment lease terminations where the condition of equipment was legally contested. The second was the formalized collaboration with Richard Bauer. Their combined methodology became the standard approach for significant equipment assessments in Boone County and 3 adjacent counties. The Indiana Equipment Appraisers Association eventually developed a continuing education module on acoustic diagnostic methodology, based substantially on the paper Richard and Tommy had published. At a county assessors meeting in the fall of 1995, Richard Bauer stood up and described what he had learned from the collaboration, not in a way that diminished his own practice but in a way that was accurate about the limitations of visual inspection methodology and what acoustic analysis could add to it. He did this in front of the same people he had addressed 2 years earlier when he had raised concerns about unvalidated methodology. Tommy was not at the meeting. He heard about it from a mutual contact. He said what he said, the contact reported, and then he said it was a correction of what he'd said before, and then he sat down. He's a careful man, Tommy told Ruth that evening. He was careful in the wrong direction first, then careful in the right direction. Is that enough? Ruth asked. It's more than most people manage, Tommy said. The third change was the teaching, but that came later. The Cunningham sale, October 1996. The first time Tommy turned over a full assessment to Richard Bauer and served only as consultant was at the Cunningham farm dispersal. The estate was contested again, another family dispute about equipment valuation, and the legal representation required a USPAPE certified assessor as primary evaluator. Richard handled the full assessment with Tommy's acoustic methodology integrated as a secondary analysis. Tommy walked the lot at 5 in the morning, made his notes, and gave them to Richard before the documentation session began. Richard's formal report cited the acoustic findings in a separately labeled section with Tommy's track record appended. The opposing assessor, not Hollings this time, challenged the acoustic findings during the deposition. Richard answered the challenge without consulting Tommy. He had spent 2 years learning the methodology well enough to explain and defend it on technical grounds, not just to endorse it. Tommy heard about the deposition from Callaway's attorney. Bauer handled it well, the attorney said. He knows the methodology. He should, Tommy said. He's been using it for 2 years. What Tommy did not say, because it was not the kind of thing he said directly, was that this was the moment the collaboration became something more than a professional arrangement. Richard had defended the work as if it were his own, because in one sense it had become his own. He had incorporated it into his practice so thoroughly that he understood its logic from the inside. The Equipment Show, Fall 1997. The Indiana Agricultural Equipment Show was held annually in Indianapolis, and Tommy attended most years, walking the exhibition halls the way he walked auction lots, listening, noting, building the pattern library that was always in the process of being extended. He ran into Richard Bauer at the John Deere exhibit, where a new tractor model was on display with a technician demonstrating its onboard diagnostic system, a computer interface that displayed engine parameters in real time, the manufacturer's answer to the assessment problem. They stood together watching the demonstration. The technician was explaining how the system could identify fault codes and schedule maintenance alerts. "What does it hear?" Tommy asked the technician. The technician looked at him. "I'm sorry?" "The sensors it uses. Are they acoustic? Vibration-based? Temperature?" "Primarily oil pressure and electrical sensors," the technician said. "With some vibration monitoring for the transmission." "So it monitors what it measures," Tommy said. "Not what the machine is actually doing." The technician was not sure how to respond. Richard said, quietly, beside Tommy, "The challenge is that the sounds a machine makes are a more complete signal than what any single sensor can capture. The sensor tells you one variable, the sound tells you the relationship between multiple variables simultaneously." Tommy looked at him. This was an accurate technical statement, and it was Richard's synthesis of what he had learned over 4 years, arrived at independently, expressed precisely. "That's right," Tommy said. They walked on to the next exhibit. The back porch, summer 1998. In the summer of 1998, Ruth Wescott reached her 2-year remission mark from breast cancer, the point at which her oncologist used the word clear with a confidence that changed the quality of the days that followed. Tommy had reduced his workload significantly during the diagnosis and treatment. He had not talked about this publicly, and he had not talked about Ruth's illness publicly, and this was consistent with how he handled everything that was not directly about the work. What he had talked about, in the evenings of those 2 years, was the specific and unusual thing the experience had taught him about listening. "With machines, I direct the listening," he said to Ruth, sitting on the back porch of the house in Thorntown, the late summer fields visible in the fading light. "I choose where to put the stethoscope. I focus on what I need to find. But with you, I couldn't direct anything. All I could do was be present." "That was hard for you," Ruth said. "I kept wanting to identify the problem and fix the problem. But that's not what was needed." "No," he said. "What was needed was to let you tell me what you were going through, without me solving it. Just receiving it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "The machines tell you what they are," she said. "You listen. You don't try to make them something different. With you I kept trying to make the situation different than it was." "Yes," Ruth said. "You did." She paused. "You got better at it." "Late," Tommy said. "Better late," Ruth said. They sat on the porch until the evening came. In the summer after Ruth's remission, Warren Calloway asked Tommy the question he had been building toward for years. "How did the accident change your work?" he asked. "Not the logistics. The work itself." They were standing in the parking lot of an auction barn in Hamilton County, before the early crowd arrived, with the morning light coming flat across the equipment lines. "It made me understand what the work was," Tommy said. "Before the accident, I thought the work was the whole process, the walking and the physical inspection and the listening all together. After the accident, when I had to redesign the physical parts, I understood that the core was the listening. Everything else was supporting infrastructure." "And knowing that changed the work?" "It focused it. When you know what the core is, you optimize for the core. I became more systematic about getting the best acoustic information, the placement sequence, how to isolate specific systems. Before the accident I was doing it, but I wasn't thinking about why I was doing it that way. After the accident I had to think about it." Calloway watched the equipment line in the morning light. "The Oliver 1650, he said. "The first day. When I gave you the brief and you went off with the stethoscope. I watched you work." "I know you did," Tommy said. "I was revising my assessment the whole time I watched. Not of the equipment, of you." He paused. "I'd come in with assumptions. I revised them. I'm telling you that directly because I don't think I said it directly at the time." Tommy looked at him. "I appreciate it," he said. "More than you might think." He meant it. He had learned, over 18 years, to let the results make the argument. What he had not entirely learned was how to receive the acknowledgement when it came, that accepting it was its own skill, distinct from needing it, and that he had become so practiced at not needing it that he had lost practice with receiving it. "The method was my father's," Tommy said. "The clarity about the method, that's mine." Calloway nodded slowly. "He's the real thing," he said, what he had said to Gerald Park at the Holbrook sale, describing Tommy to someone else. Saying it directly, to Tommy himself, felt different. Less a description than a statement made to the right person. Tommy picked up his clipboard and walked to the first piece of equipment. Tommy spent the winter of 1999 and the spring of 2000 on the first complete draft of the manual. He had been working on fragments of it since 1994, when the meridian proceeding had forced him to articulate the methodology in terms that could be explained. Each articulation had produced refinements. The process of explaining a thing clearly forces understanding of the thing in ways that doing it intuitively does not. The manual was not a how-to guide. He was honest in the opening pages about what it was and was not, a reference document that described the acoustic signatures of specific equipment conditions, the diagnostic logic connecting acoustic evidence to mechanical state, and the documentation practices that could make the assessments useful in formal contexts. It could not substitute for 40 years of pattern recognition. What it could do was give someone with mechanical experience a framework for extending their existing diagnostic capability in a specific direction. He added a section on working under constraints. He described his own constraints, the prosthetic leg, the modifications to his movement and positioning it required, the specific adjustments to stethoscope positioning he had developed to compensate for balance challenges on uneven terrain. He wrote this not as a disability narrative but as an engineering note: here are the constraints, here are the adaptations, here is what the adapted method can and cannot do. He included it because he had learned, over 20 years, that the thing people assumed would limit his work was irrelevant to the actual quality of the work, and that documenting this clearly, in a technical context where it could be evaluated on technical grounds, was more useful than any argument he could make directly. Ruth read the section before he sent the first draft to the professor at Purdue who had expressed interest. "You're not hiding it anymore," she said. "I never hid it," Tommy said. "I just didn't include it when it wasn't relevant. Now it is." "Why now?" "Because the manual is used as a training document. People training in this methodology might have various constraints. What I learned adapting to mine might be useful to them." Ruth looked at the section for a long moment. "It's the most personal thing you've ever written." "It's technical documentation," Tommy said. "It's both," Ruth said. He left the section in. In 2001, Tommy accepted his first long-term student. Her name was Carla Reyes. She was 28 years old, had a degree in mechanical engineering from Indiana State, and had spent 4 years doing industrial equipment maintenance at a manufacturing plant in Kokomo. She had read the manual and written him a letter, 2 pages, single-spaced, the most carefully argued request for instruction he had ever received. Carla had analyzed the manual with the precision of an engineer, identified the gap between what the manual described and what the manual could teach, and proposed a specific structured engagement, a 1-year working arrangement in which she attended auctions with him and applied her existing diagnostic skills under his supervision, documenting the delta between her assessments and his. Tommy showed the letter to Ruth. "Hire her," Ruth said. "I wasn't thinking of." "Hire her," Ruth said. "You've been worried for years about what happens to the method. Here is someone asking to learn it in a way that might actually work." He hired her. The year that followed was the most professionally interesting of Tommy's post-accident career. Carla's industrial equipment diagnostic experience had given her a strong foundation. She could hear machinery the way an experienced mechanic hears it. What she didn't have was the agricultural specific pattern library, 40 years of agricultural equipment failure modes in the specific operational contexts of the American Midwest. He taught her by working alongside her and comparing assessments, letting her assess and then comparing and discussing where they differed and why. Not telling her the right answer before she gave hers. His father had taught him that this was the wrong order. In the first 3 months, their major finding agreement rate was 67%. By the end of the year, it was 89%. The remaining 11% was the gap between 11 months of agricultural equipment experience and 45 years. That 11% closes with time, Tommy told her. Not with instruction. "How much time?" "Ask me in 10 years, Tommy said. "I'm planning to still be here in 10 years, Carla said. "Good," Tommy said. "Then ask me." He also told her about Richard Bauer, and about the 4040, and about what it meant to let the work make the argument. He told it as a story, once, because Carla had asked about the Meridian case and it was part of the answer. She listened with the quality of attention he associated with people who were genuinely learning something rather than acquiring information. "Did it bother you?" she asked. When Bauer was saying those things publicly. "Less than I expected," Tommy said. "What bothered me was that he hadn't looked at the records first. He had an opinion before the evidence. That's the error." He paused. The fact that he was saying it publicly was just the form the error took. When he looked at the records, he revised the opinion. That's the right response. "And the public correction?" "That's character," Tommy said. "That's separate from the professional error." The last auction where Tommy Wescott did a full evaluation of an entire lot was the Morgan County Estate dispersal in October 2005. He was 56 years old and in good health, but the 10-hour days of the larger auctions had begun to produce a fatigue that didn't resolve fully between events, and he had known for 2 years that the current pace was not the pace he would maintain indefinitely. Carla was with him, as she had been at most auctions since 2001. The Morgan County lot had 63 items from a well-run operation sold when the owner retired with no family to continue. The equipment was uniformly well maintained, which made the evaluation harder in one sense. Fine distinctions between degrees of good become important when everything is good. They worked the lot together for the first time in the way they had been building toward for 4 years, Tommy handling the most complex pieces, where acoustic signatures were subtle or where specific failure modes required the most experienced ear, Carla handling the more straightforward pieces and the documentation, with Tommy reviewing her notes. They finished at 11:45. The follow-up reports, 18 months later, showed a combined accuracy rate of 93.1% on major findings. Tommy's individual pieces, 96.2%. Carla's, 94%. He called her when he received the data. 94%, he said. Is that good? She asked. At your experience level, it's what I had, Tommy said. In another 5 years it'll be 94. You're very precise about the projections. I have 48 years of data, Tommy said. I should be. Tommy spent the winter of 2007 to 2008 on the fourth and final revision of the manual. Each revision had incorporated what he had learned since the previous one. The fourth was substantially different from the first, procedural and analytical rather than primarily descriptive, showing how to listen rather than just what to hear. In the third revision he had added Patricia Guerrero's failure probability data. She ran an equipment repair shop in an adjacent county and had 12 years of agricultural equipment repair records that complemented Tommy's acoustic diagnostic data precisely. In the fourth revision he added the material Carla had suggested. She had said, in the year after she read the third revision, you wrote that the accident made the method visible. That without the constraint, you might have kept thinking the work was everything, the whole physical process, instead of understanding that the core was the listening. Yes, Tommy said. I've been thinking about what that means for the people training in this. They don't have your constraint. But they can still ask the question, what is the core? What would this look like if I had to do it with less? Put it in the manual, she said. He put it in the manual. He wrote the epigraph for the fourth revision after 3 weeks of thinking. Every machine tells you what it is, if you know how to listen. The listening takes years to learn and cannot be rushed. What you can do, starting now, is begin. He sent the manual to the printer and went to the auction. Richard Bauer retired from active assessment work in the fall of 2008, turning the business over to his son Daniel, who had spent 4 years working alongside his father and who had learned the combined methodology as his baseline practice. On the day Richard retired, he drove out to Tommy's farm in Thorntown. Not to a meeting, not to an auction, not for any professional purpose. He parked in the driveway and knocked on the back door and Ruth let him in and made coffee and the three of them sat at the kitchen table for an hour and a half. They talked about the years of the collaboration, specific assessments they remembered, the Meridian case and what it had established, the cases that came after. They talked about Carla Reyes, who by 2008 had an independent practice with 3 of her own clients and whose accuracy rate had reached 92.6%. Near the end, Richard said, I want to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. Tommy waited. When I was making those statements at the association meetings, the unvalidated methodology arguments, I was wrong in 2 different ways at the same time. Richard looked at his coffee cup. I was professionally wrong, because I hadn't looked at the evidence before forming the opinion. That was a methodology error. But I was also wrong in a different way, which is that I was using the professional argument to manage something I didn't want to examine directly. What was that? Ruth asked. The prosthetic leg, Richard said. I'm not proud of this. I'm saying it because it's true. When I heard that Callaway was using Wescott for assessments, my first response was the professional argument, the unvalidated methodology concern. But underneath that, faster than the professional thought, was, a man with one leg doing equipment assessments? That can't be serious. He paused. That thought was the real problem. The professional argument was the form it took. The kitchen was quiet. You corrected the professional record, Tommy said. I corrected the one I could correct, Richard said. The other one, the one underneath, I'm correcting now. By saying it. Ruth looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at Richard. I know, Tommy said. I knew at the time. I thought you might, Richard said. It didn't change what the work was, Tommy said. It never does. No, Richard said. It doesn't. He picked up his coffee cup. But it should have been said. They sat for a while longer, and then Richard Bauer drove home. Ruth and Tommy sat at the kitchen table after he left. He's a careful man, Ruth said. He is, Tommy said. He was careful in the wrong direction, then careful in the right direction, then careful enough to say the thing that was underneath. She looked at Tommy. That's the full circuit. Yes, Tommy said. It is. The auction barn in Boone County, Indiana smells the same in every season, and in the autumn of 2018 it smelled of diesel and straw and the dry sweet odor of iron that has earned its rest, the same as it had always smelled. Tommy Wescott was 69 years old and he was standing at the entrance to the equipment lineup not with a stethoscope but with a cup of coffee, watching Carla Reyes work a 2004 Casey Magnum 215 in the cool morning light. He had retired from full-time assessment work in 2012. He still came to the auctions, to watch, to answer questions that Carla or her students brought to him, to maintain the connection to the thing he had done for 50 years. But he no longer carried the stethoscope. His hands were the same hands they had always been, but they were 69 years old, and the cold went into the joints in a way he had learned to acknowledge. Carla was working the Magnum with the efficient economy of someone who had been doing this for 17 years. Her accuracy rate in 2018, by the documentation record she maintained, was 94.1% on major findings. She had trained 2 people, her brother Carlos, whose rate after his 3rd year was 88.1%, and a woman named Diane Hollis, a farm equipment mechanic for 15 years, whose rate after her 2nd year was 86.4%. Tommy had given the method to Carla in thirds. A third was the foundation she had brought, the engineering degree and the industrial diagnostic experience. A third was the formal training, the 4 years of working alongside him and comparing assessments. A third was the years after, the accumulated pattern library that could only be built by doing the work in actual conditions, being right often enough to calibrate against and wrong occasionally enough to learn from. He could not give a person the first third. They had to bring it. He could not give them the third third. It came with time. What he could give was the middle third. Daniel Bauer was running the Bauer appraisal business with the combined methodology as his foundation. Warren Calloway was in the auction barn somewhere, 62 years old now, still coming to the larger sales. They had worked together for 25 years and had arrived at the kind of professional relationship built entirely from work and nonetheless real. Ruth was in the car, which was where she waited when she came with him to the auctions. She had come to most auctions for 52 years, not because she had any interest in equipment but because the auctions were where Tommy was, and after 52 years she understood that being where Tommy was had its own value. Tommy watched Carla finish with the Magnum and move to a 1998 John Deere 8400, approaching it in the sequence he had taught her, and he thought about the morning in 1955 when his father had set him on the hood of a tractor and said, "Listen, not watch." He had listened. For 63 years, to machines and to people and to the things that could not be fixed and could only be sat with, and the listening had been the whole of it, the whole career, the whole adaptation, the whole understanding of what he could do and what he couldn't do and what the difference was between those two things. He thought about Richard Bauer sitting at the kitchen table in 2008, saying the thing that was underneath the professional argument, the harder thing, the one that required a different kind of examination than the professional error had required. I'm correcting it now. By saying it. Tommy had thought about this often in the 10 years since. Most people corrected the professional error when they had to. Very few corrected the thing underneath it, because correcting the thing underneath it required admitting the thing existed. He thought about Calloway saying, "I'd come in with assumptions. I revised them. The clean version, offered directly. Received directly." Small exchanges that were, in fact, not small, because they were honest, and honesty between people who have worked together for a long time has its own weight. He thought about Ruth saying, "You adapted to the leg like it was a carburetor problem." And then, "Not to me it wasn't." Both things true simultaneously, about the same event, from the same person, and the fact that both could be true was not a contradiction but a description of how large experiences actually are. Large enough to contain very different truths depending on where you are standing. He finished his coffee and walked over to where Carla was working. "What do you hear?" he asked. Carla listened for a moment. "Rear differential," she said. "Slight bearing roughness. Not critical." "Check the left side specifically," Tommy said. "The roughness is asymmetric." Carla repositioned the stethoscope and listened for 30 seconds. "Left rear more pronounced," she said. "Right side compensating?" "Right," Tommy said. "Both bearings are going, but the left is further along. Build that into the report." Carla noted it and looked at Tommy. You heard that from 15 feet away. I heard it from over there, Tommy said, gesturing at where he had been standing. I came over to confirm. Carla looked at him the way people had always looked at him when he did this, the slight widening, the recalibration. You should still be in there with the stethoscope, she said. You're in there with the stethoscope, Tommy said. That's the point. He walked back toward the entrance, back toward Ruth's car, back toward the cool October morning and the long full life of a man who had listened his way to everything that mattered. The auction barn smelled of diesel and straw and iron, the same as always. The machines were telling their stories. Someone was listening. The acoustic diagnostic methodology described in this novel, using sound analysis to assess the mechanical condition of equipment, is a real practice, employed in various forms in industrial maintenance, military equipment maintenance, and some areas of agricultural equipment service. It has not been systematically formalized for agricultural equipment assessment in the way this novel depicts, though the diagnostic logic it describes is grounded in real acoustic engineering principles. The Meridian Estate proceeding and Judge Hollingsworth's ruling are fictional. The legal framework for expert testimony regarding non-standard assessment methodologies is real, and the question of how courts weigh unconventional methodology against conventional credentialing is an active area of practice in multiple fields. The USPAPE, Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, is a real professional standard governing appraisal methodology in the United States. Tommy Wescott is fictional. Warren Calloway is fictional. Richard Bauer, Carla Reyes, and all other characters are fictional. Boone County, Indiana is real. The Saturday machinery auction culture of the rural Midwest, with its specific smells and sounds and social dynamics, is real. Paul Wescott's instruction, listen, not watch, is the kind of thing that fathers with specific knowledge pass to their children, and it is the kind of thing that takes a lifetime to fully understand.